As soon as they left the synagogue, they entered the house of Simon and Andrew with James and John. Now Simon's mother-in-law was in bed with a fever, and they told him about her at once. He came and took her by the hand and lifted her up. Then the fever left her, and she began to serve him. That evening at sunset, they brought to him all who were sick or possessed with demons. And the whole city was gathered around the door. And he cured many who were sick with various diseases, and cast out many demons. And he would not permit the demons to speak, because they knew him. In the morning, while it was still very dark, he got up and went out to a deserted place, and there he prayed. And Simon and his companions hunted for him. When they found him, they said to him, "Everyone is searching for you." And he answered, "Let us go on to the neighboring towns, so that I may proclaim the message there also. For that is what I came out to do." And he went throughout Galilee, proclaiming the message in their synagogues, and casting out their demons. The word of the Lord. My sermon today is entitled, "The First and Greatest Deacon." Today's reading from the book of Mark directly follows last week's, when Jesus exorcised the demons in the temple at Capernaum. So Jesus had just performed his first miracle in Mark, the first of the Gospels to have been written, and it had been messy. There was lots of screaming and shouting and shaking at this exorcism in the synagogue. And I can only imagine that Jesus himself was a little bit shaken after this public splash of an exorcism. So afterwards, Jesus and James and John and Simon and Andrew walked from the synagogue to Simon's home, which was also the home to Simon's extended family. Once they got there, it was made known that the mother of Simon's wife was in bed with a fever. So there was no rest for Jesus. He went to her, took her by the hand, and raised her up. Then, according to the English translations that are out there, she began to serve them. Now, a lot happened after this brief interaction between these two. As soon as his mother got up and began to work, the entryway to the house filled up with people seeking to be healed. Indeed, the whole town was gathered there. Everybody in the entire city was there at this doorstep. As would become common throughout his ministry, Jesus eventually snuck out, and he went to an isolated place to worship. When his friends found him, he declared that it was time to really get started, to travel to the different villages around Galilee, proclaiming the good news and healing the sick. So, it was from this little house in the village of Capernaum that Jesus launched his public ministry of traveling from place to place, preaching, proclaiming the good news, and performing miracles. There was something about that place. It says in the next chapter that when Jesus returned to Capernaum, the people heard that he was at home. Home. Now, I've heard of Jesus of Nazareth, and Jesus was born in Bethlehem. But the people call Capernaum Jesus' home. Somehow, in the brief time between coming upon the fishing disciples and departing to walk around Galilee, that house in Capernaum had become his home. There was something about that place. It wasn't just the place, though. I think there was something about that woman. The mother of the wife of Simon Peter. As is the case with so many heroines in the scriptures, she goes unnamed, as does her daughter. And she's virtually unknown. I forget about her entirely until we have a mark here in the lectionary. And then she usually isn't even considered then. Really, the entirety of her written story is this. Simon's mother-in-law was in bed, sick with a fever, and they told Jesus about her at once. He went to her, took her by the hand, and raised her up. The fever left her, and she began to serve. 3 lines. three powerful lines. Within them, Jesus performs the first physical healing to be recorded in any gospel. He grasps her hand and lifts her up. This matriarch gets to work. After these lines, the entire town comes to her doorstep. After these lines, Jesus launches his public ministry into Galilee. There was something about that woman. Let's take a closer look at what's going on. Now, as I said before, the English translations say that this mother of the house got up to serve her. My mind, through constant patriarchal conditioning, pictures her serving food to a bunch of men sitting around in the house. The word that the gospel writer uses, though, goes far beyond this specific idea of serving. The Greek word, diakoneo, is the verb in question. It means to minister, to provide for, to take care of. It specifically refers to ministering to those who are the most vulnerable and outcast. Since many of you are familiar with the book of Acts, since you've been doing a study on it, you know the story of Stephen and the 6 other men who were chosen to be deacons. We often think of these men as starting that office of the deacon. In truth, though, the first and greatest deacon was this deaconess. She gets up and diakonate them. She deacons them. She ministers to them. She provides for them. She takes care of them. She ministers to everyone in the household, and the vulnerable throughout the whole town come to her doorstep. Yes, it is Jesus who healed her, and it's Jesus who heals all these people at the front door. Yet, it is her ministry that has made this place a welcome one to everybody in the town. The townspeople are drawn to the house because they are comfortable there. Heck, a few chapters later, some folks are even comfortable enough to cut a hole in the roof and lower a paralytic into that house. I'm convinced that all of these people felt at home and thus comfortable there, and seeing this strange man who was going to heal them because of the ministry that had already been done by this deaconess. There was something about that woman. It wasn't just the townspeople who felt at home, though. As mentioned, Jesus himself thought of this place as home. This wandering Palestinian stranger just walked in off the street with her son-in-law, and yet she welcomed him and began to minister to him. I am sure that she had heard about the commotion at the synagogue and knew that her life and the life of her entire family was about to change. And yet she welcomed him and began to minister to him. He would start a movement that would set the region on fire and turn the society upside down. And yet she welcomed him and began to minister to him. He would bring the full weight of the Roman Empire down on his shoulders and the shoulders of his followers, and yet she welcomed him, and she began to minister to him. And that empire would systematically kill him, kill his followers, and kill her own son-in-law, Simon Peter. And yet she welcomed him and began to minister to him. There was something about that deaconess, and there was something about her ministry. For immediately after their interaction, he started healing the multitudes and traveling the countryside to all of Galilee, proclaiming the good news. Now, the author of Mark did not provide her name. The author of Mark did not give her a voice. Indeed, I learned this week that only 1% of the spoken words in the Bible are spoken by women. Yet it seems to me that she was integral in launching Jesus into his public ministry, and changing the entire course of history, and revealing the good news of love to the entire world. Now, I know that I'm stating the obvious here. Women have been systematically denied their voices throughout all of history. And even when their voices are portrayed, it's usually by male authors. And they decide what they're going to say. Women have been cast into obscurity, their vast contributions hidden by the men with power. And of course, women have often, and I would say most often, been the movers and shakers who actually do launch the movements that change history. It is the deaconesses who actually make the things happen. I recently watched the movie Selma. More than Martin Luther King Jr. himself, I was drawn to a woman named Amelia Boynton Robinson. In the movie, she is shown at pretty much every event. She gives an Oscar-worthy speech to Coretta Scott King, though apparently not Oscar-worthy enough for the White Male-dominated Academy. And she is beaten to unconsciousness at the front of the march across the bridge. Given my context as a rural white Midwesterner, my education about the civil rights movement was basically one of Martin the Magician, a man who single-handedly made it happen. I have since learned more about the painstaking planning done by thousands, the strategic actions implemented by people like Rosa Parks, and the complexities that result from a large group of people trying to work together. Never until this movie, though, did I hear of Amelia Boynton Robinson. As I started to read about her, I learned that she ran for Congress in 1964, a year before the march took place in Selma, making her the first African American and the first woman ever to run for office from Alabama. Since this was before the Voting Rights Act, only 5% of the registered voters were black. Yet she won over 10% of the vote. Then it was she who invited and persuaded Dr. King to focus on Selma as a staging ground to challenge the South's systematic disenfranchisement of African Americans for the vote. It was she who welcomed him, and she who began to minister to him. Prior to all of this, though, she moved all around the countryside of Alabama, fighting for voting rights for the poorest communities in the state. She was a true deaconess. Like Simon Peter's mother-in-law, a deaconess who launched a movement. So, the movement was decidedly not magical. It was maternal. Now, the roads for these deaconesses have not been easy. Their lives are not confined simply to welcoming and ministering. We learn in Matthew 11 that Jesus eventually cursed the town of Capernaum because it was so difficult to get the people there to repent after they'd experienced his miracles. But this deaconess, Simon Peter's mother-in-law, surely stayed and continued to work amongst these people that Jesus himself eventually gave up on. And Amelia Boynton Robinson, her image may actually be better known than her name and her story. She was beaten to unconsciousness and left for dead by the police on the Edmund Pettus Bridge on that bloody Sunday. An image that spread throughout American media and brought renewed momentum to the movement. When I ponder this type of police brutality, I can't help but think back to this past October. I had the opportunity to travel to Ferguson, Missouri, with some colleagues from McCormick and some other organizations from Chicago. There, I witnessed firsthand the lines of police in full riot gear as they blocked off roadways and bridges, the intimidation of billy clubs and the hefting of semi-automatic weapons, and I only saw the tip of the iceberg. There had been months of tear gassing, rubber bullet shooting, and full military patrolling. And all this in response to protests begun by teenagers, and especially, yes, you guessed it, by teenage girls. These young women sparked a movement in response to the slaying of one of their friends and brothers by a militarized police force, and they were not going to let it fizzle out. At one event, an African Methodist Episcopal pastor named Renita Lampkin stood up to speak. She, like Amelia Boynton Robinson, had started a lot of media frenzy because she was shot in the stomach by a rubber bullet. She was also the victim of police brutality in these protests. And like Amelia Boynton Robinson, photos of her injuries sparked outrage across the United States. In the speech that we heard her give, she talked about all of these children being brutalized by the police as her children. She spoke of Michael Brown as somebody who was raised in her community, thrived in her community, and was killed in her community. She proclaimed that we must stand up to those who would inflict violence upon our children, that we must stand in front of the gun and say, not this one. This one is mine. Like Simon's mother-in-law, like Amelia Boynton Robinson, she is a deaconess. Michael Brown, Jimmy Lee Jackson, Jesus of Nazareth. Not these. These are ours. These deaconesses, along with the mothers of these young men, saw them slaughtered by the apparatuses of the empires that their lives sought to transform. But let us not be dismayed to the point of despair. For as Isaiah said to us, have you not known? Have you not heard? Has it not been told to you from the beginning? Have you not understood from the foundations of the earth? It is he who sits above the circle of the earth, and its inhabitants are like grasshoppers, who stretches out the heavens like a curtain and spreads them like a tent to live in, who brings princes to naught and makes the rulers of the earth as nothing. Scarcely are they planted, scarcely sown, scarcely has their stem taken root in the earth when he blows upon them, and they wither, and the tempest carries them off like stubble. And hear the good news. Those who wait for the Lord shall renew their strength. They shall mount up with wings like eagles, and they shall run and not be weary. They shall walk and not faint. When I look out on this congregation and on the visitors of First Presbyterian Church of Chicago, I see deaconesses. I see women who have raised children, both their own and not their own. I see women who have ministered to the sick, the hungry, the incarcerated. I see women who continuously stand up, lead others, and run programs to fight against unfair health care, unequal food access, and unjust criminal justice systems. I see women who have loved and lost and kept their faith. I see women who lead this church. I recently had a conversation with my mom, in which she told me that I make her feel like she matters. It's quite the opposite, though. It's the deaconesses who give meaning to the rest of us, who start the movements, who launch us into the lives to which we are called. May we all follow the lead of these deaconesses, these Renita Lampkins, these Amelia Boynton Robinsons, these unnamed heroines in Scripture, the women in this very room. May we join the songs of Miriam. May we join the songs of Deborah. May we join the songs of Mary. May we dance with the wind over the waters. May we move with wisdom crying out in the streets. May we stand up against injustices with the full knowledge that we may be beaten down. May we create spaces that welcome all and minister to all. May we have the courage to reach up and grab the hand that is offered to us in our time of need. May we also launch movements.